I want to start our deep dive today with one of my favorite stories. It's the ultimate metaphor for philosophy.
Oh, I think I know this one.
There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. The older fish, he just nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?"
Right.
And the two young fish, they swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?"
It's the perfect launch pad because that question, what the hell is water,
Hmm,
is precisely the question that defines, well, the entire field of metaphysics.
exactly.
We are investigating those things that are so fundamental, so pervasive, so constant, that they risk going completely unnoticed. They're the structural laws of reality itself.
And that's exactly what our source material for today is getting at. It's a contemporary metaphysics textbook, and it frames its mission perfectly to move us beyond being those unreflective swimmers who just take reality for granted. We're here to elicit that reaction of amazement the older fish's question generates. We're taking a deep dive into the underlying structure of everything.
And our goal today is pretty ambitious. We're going to try and illustrate how modern analytic philosophers, the metaphysicians of the 21st century, are tackling these huge structural questions.
So what exactly is metaphysics in this sense?
It's the rational investigation of the most general structure of reality. We're not asking specific, empirical scientific questions like, what is DNA or what are electrons?
Those are empirical discoveries.
Exactly. Those are things you find out in a lab. We are asking the structural questions underneath all that. Questions like, what are the rules governing composition? Or what is a substance? Or even, does time actually flow?
What I really appreciate about the source material is that it immediately stresses that this isn't some recent invention. This isn't just something that began with logical positivism.
No, not at all.
It shows this remarkable continuity. We're discussing the problems that metaphysicians are dealing with today, but they are the direct descendants of the core questions raised by, well, the titans of history: Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, Hume.
We are all essentially swimming in that same metaphysical water.
We just have a more rigorous toolkit now and a much, much better understanding of logic.
That continuity is key. So first, we're going to look at that methodological toolkit. How do metaphysicians actually build arguments and test theories in a field that isn't, primarily empirical?
Right.
Then we'll tackle the biggest question of all: what exists? After that, we'll dive into the mystery of identity. And finally, we'll examine how both physical and abstract reality is constructed through parts and structure.
Okay, let's unpack this toolkit because I think metaphysics often gets a bad rap. People think it's just abstract or simply a clash of unsupported opinions.
A lot of hand-waving.
But the sources are clear. This field consists of rigorous arguments, both deductive and non-deductive. And that rigor, like all good reasoning, it has to start with defining your terms precisely.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
We have to start by establishing a clear distinction between definitions of words and definitions of things.
Yeah.
This is the difference between what philosophers call a nominal and a real definition. It's a point that's often lost in casual conversation, but philosophically, it's essential.
So if I ask for the nominal definition of, let's say, the word substance, what am I actually asking for?
You are investigating the meaning and usage of the term substance in the English language, or whatever conceptual framework you're using.
So it's about the word itself.
Yes. You're looking at the word, its history, its connotation, how we use it to communicate. It's really an investigation into linguistics and concepts.
But if you're doing serious metaphysics, you're usually aiming for something deeper, for the real definition.
Precisely. The real definition characterizes the essence of the entity itself. To discover the real definition attached to the term X, you have to investigate the entity or entities indicated by X.
So it's one thing to ask what the English word substance means.
And it's quite another, and much more profound, to ask what substances are. The goal is to characterize the thing's fundamental nature, not just clarify how we use a word. The real definition, if you can get it, reveals a necessary truth about reality.
So is the real definition an empirical problem then? Like discovering the definition of water is H2O, or is it purely logical about revealing necessary structure?
It can be both. Water's definition, H2O, that's a necessary truth we discovered empirically. But for these big structural concepts like identity or existence, the real definition is generally sought through rational, non-empirical argument.
And this is where it gets tricky.
It is, because we have to acknowledge that when we start questioning these structural aspects of reality, we inevitably run up against what philosophers call common sense and intuitions.
And we are, by necessity, just completely immersed in common sense
Of
beliefs.
course.
Things like the belief that the earth revolves around the sun today, or, historically, the belief in spontaneous generation, that worms just sort of spring from dirt.
And the source reminds us that common sense beliefs, like all other beliefs, are fallible. The examples show they vary between communities and they change over time. Common sense is where we start, but it's not where we end.
So when common sense is challenged, what do we have left? We have to rely on intuitions.
Right, but what are intuitions? And there are two fundamentally opposed views on this, which is crucial for understanding how metaphysicians argue.
Okay, what's the first view?
On one side, you have the neo-rationalists, including thinkers like George Beeler and John Bengtson. They maintain that intuitions are highly peculiar mental states or events. They're distinct from belief or judgment.
So there's something else entirely.
They treat them as akin to intellectual perception, a kind of mind's eye or inner light. They see them as non-inferential evidence.
So the truth is just sort of grasped immediately, and that mental state itself constitutes evidence, even if it might be fallible. What's a good example of something we might intuit that would form a starting point for metaphysics?
A classic one would be the intuition that all things are self-identical, that A equals A.
Right. Seems pretty basic.
Or the intuition that if you have a part of something, that part cannot be more spatially extended than the whole thing itself. For the neo-rationalists, this immediate apprehension provides a unique, foundational form of evidence for these basic, necessary truths. It's evidence that isn't derived from looking at the world.
Okay, but then you have the skeptics. They're exemplified by thinkers like Timothy Williamson, who are, let's say, deeply wary of this mind's eye language.
Very wary.
They feel it just provides a convenient escape route when you really need a justification.
Williamson argues that what we call intuitions are nothing more than our ordinary, deeply held beliefs, just given a more grandiose name when we haven't taken the time or effort to justify them rigorously.
And his crucial point is methodological, right? It's highly critical.
It is. He says the mere fact that we believe or intuit that P is true cannot be considered evidence in support of P.
And I can see why that's so important for maintaining rigor. If your belief that P automatically serves as evidence for P, then in any disagreement, everyone has a trivial, self-justifying argument for their own opinion.
Exactly.
It just ends the discussion before the debate can even start.
It completely trivializes disagreement. A metaphysical argument has to rely on something stronger than just asserting, well, I just intuit to be true, so that's my evidence.
So we need stronger tools to test those basic beliefs.
Which leads us nicely to thought experiments.
Okay, now that we've outlined the role of intuition and why skeptics like Williamson are so wary of the mind's eye, let's move on to the more practical testing side of the toolkit. How do you run an experiment in metaphysics?
Well, you use the thought experiment. Thought experiments are absolutely vital because they allow us to test a metaphysical thesis by imagining a possible situation. The key constraint is that the situation should, at a bare minimum, be logically consistent.
And if it's logically possible.
Then we can formulate an evaluation relevant to the thesis we're testing. It's essentially using the power of imagination, but constrained by logic, to test claims about necessary truths.
And the classic, most illustrative example in contemporary philosophy of mind and metaphysics has to be David Chalmers' zombies. This is a test case for physicalism.
Yes. And just to be clear, in this context, Chalmers zombies are not the flesh-eating undead of popular culture.
No, definitely not.
They are creatures that are physically identical to human beings, down to the last neuron, the last particle. They walk, they talk, they eat, they behave exactly as we do.
But crucially,
They lack conscious mental states. They have no inner subjective experience, no what philosophers call qualia. They're philosophical zombies.
and this isn't a scientific question, right? It's a question about possibility. If you assume that these zombies are possible entities, meaning we can conceive of a world where they exist even if they aren't actual, what does that tell us about the relationship between consciousness and the physical brain?
Well, if zombies are possible, it means there is at least one possible world where the precise physical configuration of the brain is identical to ours, but where there are no accompanying conscious mental states.
Okay.
And this, according to Chalmers' argument, refutes the thesis of the necessary identity between mind and brain. It shows that consciousness is not necessarily physical, which challenges strong physicalism. The thought experiment functions as a counterexample to a claim of necessity.
It's essentially a non-deductive form of argumentation, which brings us to another major tool in the kit, inference to the best explanation, or IBE.
Hmm.
How does IDE fit into metaphysics, given that we don't have empirical labs to run trials?
IBE is essential because, as the source notes, metaphysics consists of arguments, and that includes non-deductive ones. If you have two competing theories, say one theory about the nature of abstract objects and another about the nature of time, and they both account for the observations we have.
Including our intuitive and common sense beliefs.
Right. IBE provides the rational criteria for preferring one over the other based on certain theoretical virtues. It's a way of moving from raw data points to a coherent worldview.
So what are the key virtues that make one explanation best in the eyes of a metaphysician?
The primary virtue cited is ontological economy. This essentially asks, how lean and clean is your theory?
Don't multiply entities unnecessarily.
That's the heart of it. It's typically split into two types. Quantitative economy, which is fewer individual entities, and qualitative economy, which is fewer kinds of entities.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A theory that posits three distinct fundamental categories of abstract objects, say Platonic forms, possible worlds, and numbers, is less economically sound than one that manages to reduce those phenomena down to only two kinds, assuming they have equal explanatory power.
That sounds like a sophisticated, formal version of Occam's razor. If you can explain the same amount with less baggage, your theory is better.
Precisely. And the second critical virtue is epistemic accessibility.
What does that mean?
This refers to how knowable the theory is. If a theory posits mysterious entities that are causally disconnected from us, and we can only gain knowledge of them through some vague, special faculty.
Like that questionable mind's eye intuition we were just talking about.
Exactly. That theory is less preferable. We prefer theories where the entities are epistemically accessible through common means, whether that's perception, logic, or well-understood inferential reasoning. The goal is to maximize explanatory power while minimizing mystery and ontological commitment.
So these virtues help move metaphysical debates beyond simple assertion.
And into a reasoned comparative analysis.
That's a fantastic overview of the tools. Now let's use them to dive into the core of metaphysics. The question of existence, or ontology. What is there?
Egg one.
Our source material frames this immediately with a great contemporary example, a text exchange between two friends, Dino and Pino.
And Dino and Pino are grappling with something most people never even consider. If something doesn't exist, how can we talk about it?
Right. Pino brings up the non-existent planet Vulcan,
Which was hypothesized to explain Mercury's orbital motion before relativity proved it unnecessary.
and the fictional character Zaphod Beeblebrox from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
And Pino's attempt to be precise hits the philosophical paradox perfectly. He says, if Vulcan doesn't exist, there is something that doesn't exist.
And then he ties himself in a knot.
He does. He says, now, as far as I'm aware, saying that there is something is the same as saying that something exists. So something exists that doesn't exist.
That is the foundational problem of negative existential statements that seem true, but logically imply a contradiction.
And that paradox sets up the two main competing answers to the grand ontological question. What exists?
Let's start with the most common and powerful answer. It's one that, at first glance, seems trivial, but is massively influential. Answer 1, the standard view, or everything exists.
This view, which is associated very strongly with philosophers like W.V.O. Quine and Peter van Inweg, argues for an equivalence. To be is to exist.
Okay.
They argue that the question, what exists and what is there, are equivalent. They're just stylistic variations, and the answer is always the same. Everything is there and everything exists. There is no middle ground and no separate realm of non-existent things.
And Quine gives us that famous slogan that acts as the backbone of this position.
Yeah.
To be is to be the value of a variable.
Yes.
What does that mean in practical terms for someone who may not be steeped in formal logic?
It's essentially about theoretical commitment. In formal logic, we use variables x, y, z that range over a domain of objects. The slogan means that existence is expressed by the particular quantifier, the symbol that looks like a backwards E.
Which we read as, there is at least one object such that.
Exactly. The quantifier simply asserts that something is in the domain of things we are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
If something is in that domain, if it can legitimately fill the variable x, then it exists.
And how do we know what's in that domain?
Quine argues that we should use our best scientific theory to determine that domain. If we accept a scientific theory, which is a set of quantified sentences, we commit to the existence of whatever must fill the variable to make those sentences true.
So you aren't asserting that existence is some quality of that thing?
No, you are simply asserting that it is part of the world structure we accept.
So, if my scientific theory requires the existence of electrons to explain certain phenomena, then the variable $6 in my theory will necessarily have electrons as one of its values.
And therefore, electrons exist.
Simple as that.
For Quine, yes. Existence is not a mysterious property we discover. It's an assumption baked into our most rigorous descriptions of reality.
Now, you mentioned a variant of the standard view that comes from Frege, which says that existence is a property, but not a property of individuals. How does that fit in?
Right, so the standard view in this variant holds that existence is a second-level property.
What does that mean, a second-level property?
Let's define the levels. First-level properties are attributed directly to individuals. Pinot's law. A second-level property is a property of a property. For instance, being a hair color is a second-level property of the property being blonde.
Okay, I think I follow.
So existence, then, is a property of properties. When we say black swans exist, we aren't attributing a property to a specific black swan. We're saying that the first-level property of being a black swan is instantiated by something in the world.
Ah, so that moves the focus away from individual objects and up a level of abstraction. And that neatly sidesteps the issue of saying, Arthur Dent has the property of existence.
Precisely. Whether you follow Quine, who rejects existence as any kind of property, or Frege, who accepts existence as a second-level property, the result is the same. The contradiction in that Dino and Pinot text exchange has to be resolved by denying that exists is a standard predicate we can apply to individuals like Arthur Dent or the planet Vulcan.
Which brings us back to the biggest challenge for the standard view, the problem of negative existentials. How does the everything exists view handle statements like Arthur Dent does not exist without falling into a logical contradiction?
This is where they become revisionary of natural language. As we establish, if you try to apply the rule of introduction for the particular quantifier to Arthur Dent does not exist, you logically infer. There's in $6 such that the $6 does not exist.
And since for the standard view the quantifier means exists, you are asserting that something exists that does not exist.
Which is the very contradiction they must avoid.
So, to avoid the contradiction, they have to deny that existence is a predicate. But they also have to explain away the intuitive truth of the negative existential statement about Arthur Dent. He doesn't exist, right?
Their standard strategy is to argue that the natural language statement contains a fake predicate of existence, and that to bring the logical form to light, we have to eliminate proper nouns like Arthur Dent in favor of special predicates.
How does that work?
They say what we mean when we say Arthur Dent does not exist is simply that the properties associated with that fictional character, being a galactic hitchhiker traveling with Zaphod Beeblebrox, are not instantiated by anything in reality.
Ah, so they rephrase the sentence into a statement about properties being uninstantiated.
Yes, and that move avoids the logical contradiction about objects.
Okay, so the standard view is highly ontologically minimalist. Everything that's there exists, and anything that seems not to exist is just an illusion of language that needs to be revised.
That's a great summary of it.
Now, let's pivot to answer 2, the middle way, or Meinongianism. This is the position Pinot was implicitly arguing for, the idea that we can genuinely talk about Vulcan and Zaphod Beeblebrox.
Yes. The middle way is fundamentally different because it says something exists, but something else does not. It accepts that we need to draw a firm distinction between being there, which they express using the quantifier, the backwards E, and existing, which they treat as a true predicate, a capital E.
So for the Meinongian, when we talk about Zaphod Beeblebrox, he is definitely there.
In the domain of objects, yes, the set of things we can think about.
But he lacks the property of existence.
That captures the core insight perfectly. This view is driven by the idea of Meinongian intentionality. Meinong argued that psychic acts like desiring, imagining, thinking, or fearing are constitutively directed at objects.
So if we imagine Father Christmas,
The act must be directed at an object. Father Christmas. Therefore, Father Christmas is there, in the domain of objects, or being there. Otherwise, the intentional act wouldn't be possible. But that doesn't mean he exists in the physical world. Existence for them is just one property in a bundle alongside being red or being a reindeer.
this seems wonderfully intuitive for handling fictional characters and mythological entities, but the classical Meinongian framework faced, well, massive problems that almost sank the whole ship.
They are indeed major challenges. The first is the potential violation of the principle of non-contradiction.
How so?
If objects are identified solely by bundles of properties, and we place no limitations on what properties are admissible, we can easily define impossible contradictory objects like the square circle.
So the object is defined by having the property of being square and the property of being a circle, which is impossible in our world.
And if we formalize there's a square circle and combine it with the plausible meaning postulate, if $6 is a circle, $6 is not a square, you end up with a logical contradiction. The classical Meinongian has to bite the bullet and say that contradictory objects are part of the domain of objects that are there.
And the second major problem is ontological overproduction, which is almost
Uh,
funnier.
It is. Since existence, E, is treated as a property just like any other, if you want to prove the existence of something, you simply define a bundle of properties that includes the existence property.
Oh, I see where this is going.
You take being a horse, you add being winged, and then you include the property existing. The classical Meinongian framework mandates that there must be an object defined by that bundle, meaning you can prove the existence of anything you desire, including a winged horse, just by defining it into existence.
The source calls it a creative deities competition.
Which is a great way to put it. It makes ontology trivial.
This is where contemporary metaphysics comes in, though, offering a refinement to save the core Meinongian intuition. We move to modal Meinongianism.
Right. This contemporary version, championed by thinkers like Berto and Priest, incorporates the logic of impossible worlds. The core move is simple. Contradictory objects, like the square circle, exist only in impossible worlds, where basic logical laws like non-contradiction don't apply.
So they're tucked away in a philosophical basement, so to speak.
That's a good way to think about it.
But how does that help clean up the mess in our actual possible world?
In the real world, our actual world, the square circle is neither a circle nor a square. This is because modal Meinongianism introduces the concept of existence entailing properties.
Okay, what are those?
They argue that certain properties, like being a circle, being a horse, or being square, are properties that inherently imply existence in a possible world. Since the square circle does not exist in the actual world, it cannot instantiate those properties here.
So Arthur Dent.
He exists in some possible worlds where The Hitchhiker's Guide is nonfiction, but not in ours. He's only a galactic hitchhiker in those worlds. Here, he is just an intentional object, not an actual hitchhiker, and thus does not instantiate the property of being a hitchhiker.
So the burden of proof shifts entirely onto the Meinongian to define what an existence-entailing property is, right? Why should being a circle entail existence, but not, say, the property of being the traveling companion of Zaphod Beeblebrox?
It's a huge challenge, yes. It shifts the complexity from the logic of quantification to the metaphysics of properties and modality. It saves the intuition that we can think about non-existent things and talk truly about them, which is a powerful starting point, but it requires a highly complex framework to maintain logical consistency.
So you have these two camps. The standard view gives up the intuitive ease of talking about Sherlock Holmes.
In favor of a simpler ontology and a clean logic, the Meinongian keeps the intuition but has to build this complex modal machinery. And that contrast is really the heart of the modern debate on existence.
We've established what it means to exist globally, whether you're a Quinian who thinks everything is there, or a Meinongian who reserves a special category for fictional and impossible objects. Now that we have things, the next structural question is, how does a single thing stay the same across time?
Right. We need to narrow the focus to individual identity.
The source opens this with that lovely everyday anecdote featuring Gigino and Gigina arguing about creme caramel.
Yes. Gigino tells Gigina she's no longer the same because she didn't taste his beloved dessert, which she used to adore.
And Gigina rightly points out that changing properties, like getting platinum blonde hair or developing a sudden dislike for dessert, doesn't mean she loses her identity.
This highlights the essential ambiguity in ordinary language when we use the word same. We use it to mean two very different things.
We have to clarify that distinction metaphysically.
We do. We have numerical identity, which is the unitary conception, being one single entity. It's an irreducible relation that exists between every entity in itself and nothing else. If A is numerically identical to B, they are not two things, they are one thing.
And then there's qualitative identity, which is just similarity.
Correct. Qualitative identity just means sharing properties.
Mm.
Gigina has undergone qualitative change. She is similar but not identical to the Gigina of yesterday in terms of her preferences, but she retains numerical identity. This distinction is fundamental to understanding change and persistence.
The natural philosophical attempt, then, is to try and bridge these two types of identity, to define one in terms of the other.
Of course.
And this brings us to one of the most famous principles in this field, the principle of identity of indiscernibles, or IDEN.
IDEN attempts to define numerical identity or sameness in terms of qualitative identity or indiscernibility. It states, if $60 have the exact same properties, then $6 is identical to aisle.
So if true, this would mean numerical identity consists in sharing all properties. It would reduce identity to indiscernibility. It sounds deeply logical, and it's often attributed to Leibniz.
It does sound logical. But if we accept the standard view of numerical identity, that it's an irreducible relation, then we have to reject this definitional approach.
And the source gives us a brilliant thought experiment that challenges IDEN even as a necessary truth. Black's spheres.
Max Black's thought experiment asks us to imagine a completely empty universe, except for two numerically distinct spheres.
Okay.
They're spatially separated, say by a foot, but they share all their material features. They have the exact same size, mass, color, and rotational speed. They are qualitatively indiscernible.
But because they are spatially separated, they must be two distinct entities.
Exactly. They stand in an irreflexive relation, being at a non-null spatial distance from the other.
So they can't be one and the same thing.
They must be numerically distinct. If this scenario is genuinely possible, and it seems logically consistent, then we have a case where two objects share all properties, but are not identical. Therefore, IDEN fails to be a necessary truth. We can't use shared properties to define identity.
What's the philosophical implication of that?
It's massive. It means identity remains irreducible. It is simply a brute relation.
So IDEN remains a useful principle in empirical science. If two electrons share all observable properties, we treat them as identical, but it fails as a foundation for metaphysics.
Precisely. We need identity to be fundamental. And the complexity of identity surfaces again when we try to use it in language, specifically through the principle of substitutivity. Salvo veritae.
Right, the principle that states if two expressions refer to the same thing, replacing one with the other in a true sentence should leave the sentence true.
It's the linguistic reflection of the irreducibility of identity.
But we find that substitution fails in certain contexts, which reveals how identity interacts with language and modality. Let's look at the classic examples that illustrate this failure. The first one involves quoted expressions.
This is a bit of a linguistic trick. The example is, Hesperus contains 8 letters, which is true.
Okay.
Versus phosphorus contains 8 letters, which is false. We know that Hesperus and phosphorus are coreferential. They both refer to the planet Venus. So substitution fails, seemingly violating the principle.
But the philosophical explanation is pretty straightforward here. The sentence isn't actually about the entity Venus.
No, it's about the word itself. The term is being mentioned or quoted rather than used to refer to the object. Since the sentence is about the linguistic token, not the celestial body, the principle of substitutivity doesn't apply because the premise that the terms are being used to refer to the same thing is violated.
The second counterexample is far more complex, and it involves modal contexts, specifically necessity and possibility. Let's use the Superman example first to make it more intuitive.
Good idea. The identity is Superman is Clark Kent.
Okay, so it is true that Clark Kent exists. But it's also true that it is necessary that Superman be able to fly, as part of his definition.
Right.
But if we substitute Clark Kent for Superman in that second sentence, we get, it is necessary that Clark Kent be able to fly. And that feels wrong. Many would argue his ability to fly is a contingent property, not a necessary one.
So this shows how necessity can block substitution, even when identity holds.
Now let's apply this to the philosophical example provided in the text. The true sentence is, it is necessary that 8 be greater than 7.
And the false result comes when you substitute 8 with the number of planets in the solar system, assuming they are coreferential in our current world.
The resulting sentence, it is necessary for the number of planets in the solar system to be greater than 7, is clearly false. The number of planets could contingently change.
A planet could be destroyed, or we could discover a new one, making the number different from 8.
So why does the substitution fail here? Is the identity principle wrong? Or is the sentence being read incorrectly?
The failure occurs because of an ambiguity between two readings of the modal statement, de dicto and de re.
Okay, break those down.
The de dicto reading applies the modal operator, it is necessary that, to the entire statement, the dictum, or what is said. This reading is paraphrased. It is necessary that there be in $6 such that the number of planets is $6 and $6 is greater than 7.
And that's false because the quantity of planets is contingent.
Exactly. We are making a necessary claim about a contingent state of affairs.
But the identity holds true under the Dewey reading, which saves the principle of substitutivity.
Correct. The Dree reading is about the object itself, the rest. It attributes the necessary property to it. Paraphrased, it means there is an $6 such that the number of planets is $6, and $6 is necessarily greater than 7.
Since x here refers to the number 8, and the number 8 is necessarily greater than 7.
This reading is true. It's an abstract mathematical truth. So the failure of substitution only occurs under the false didicto interpretation. The principle of the indiscernibility of identicals, or Leibniz's law, is never truly doubted. Identity remains the robust, irreducible backbone of selfhood.
We've established existence and self-identity. Now let's look at how objects are put together, which brings us to mereology, the philosophy of parts.
And the sources make a critical distinction about what composition is, separating it from any kind of action.
It's not something we do.
No. Composition, for metaphysicians, is not an action we perform, but a fundamental relation that holds between parts and the whole. When we talk about X and Y composing Z, we mean that X and Y exhaust the whole Z with no residues left over.
The source compares it to the addition of natural numbers. 2 and 3 determine 5.
It's a great analogy. The existence and nature of the parts determine the existence and nature of the whole.
This understanding of composition brings us back once again to our friend ontological economy through the extensionality of proper parts.
This is a foundational mereological principle. Two composite entities are distinct if and only if they have distinct proper parts.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that composite entities are never distinguished solely by how their proper parts are organized or structured. Structure alone cannot create a numerical difference if the list of components is identical.
This principle is designed to keep the ontology clean, but it immediately leads to some really radical challenges to our common sense world. If mereology is strictly about parts, we have to contend with the mereological nihilist.
The nihilist is the most radical position in this area. They argue that there are no composite entities at all, no tables, no chairs, no planets, and arguably no people, as we are composite entities of cells and molecules.
So what exists for the nihilist?
Only fundamental mereological atoms.
So when I'm looking at a table, the nihilist says the table does not exist.
Correct. Only atoms arranged in the manner of a table exist.
This view is ontologically extremely economical, I guess, quantitatively speaking. It drastically reduces the number of entities we must commit to.
The nihilist is the ultimate Quinian, reducing all complex objects to simpler atoms. But the consequence is that when we talk about personal identity or even the existence of a table, we're speaking useful fiction.
That has fascinating consequences for personal identity. If I am just atoms arranged in the manner of a human, where does the I go? Does my existence reduce entirely to the spatial relation of these non-composite parts?
Precisely. If we are mereological atoms arranged in a certain way, then our existence is only as a pattern or a structure, not as a unified object. The nihilist needs to explain why that specific arrangement is special, without appealing to the composition of a person.
That's a huge trade-off. You gain radical ontological economy, but you lose almost all of common sense.
Most philosophers find the loss of common that's too great, but the nihilist holds the advantage of maximal simplicity.
Now, even if we reject nihilism and allow composition, we run into serious issues with boundary conditions, specifically the problem of the many. And this is illustrated using the Schwarzhorn mountain example.
The problem arises from vagueness. The question is, where precisely does the mountain end? Is it at 1,200 meters, where the incline becomes gentle? Because the boundaries of the mountain are vague, the different ways of defining those boundaries, say, using slightly different sets of rock molecules, result in a multitude of distinct overlapping entities.
And each of these distinct entities is a valid candidate for being the Schwarzhorn.
Right. If we say all of them are the Schwarzhorn, we commit to the existence of a surprisingly large number of mountains in that one spot.
David Lewis proposed a solution that defers this problem to linguistics, calling it semantic underdetermination.
Lewis suggests the problem isn't fundamental metaphysical vagueness, but semantic vagueness. Reality is crisp. There are indeed many entities located there, each with slightly different boundaries composed of distinct molecules.
But the word Schwarzhorn is semantically underdetermined.
Exactly. It has many valid candidates for its referent, and we just don't know which one we mean when we use the word.
Yeah.
For Lewis, reality is precise, but our language is fuzzy. The problem is fixed by clarifying the word, not by revising our ontology.
But the sources note a compelling counterexample to this. Clouds. For objects like clouds, the vague boundary doesn't feel like a linguistic failure. It feels inherent to the object's nature.
It does.
Where does a cloud end? Which water molecules are proper parts and which are just passing through?
This is a brilliant distinction. The mountain, being made of rock, is largely stationary and rigid. We can, at least hypothetically, define its boundaries, even if the word doesn't.
But for entities like clouds, or even a crowd,
The lack of precise boundaries seems to be a hallmark of their very nature. They're constantly changing, diffusing, and lacking sharp mereological demarcation. This challenges Lewis's semantic approach.
so if the vagueness is truly ontological, a feature of the thing itself, not our language,
Then, the strict mereological principle of extensionality of proper parts becomes almost impossible to apply, since it's undefined what precise set of proper parts a cloud even has at any moment.
this complexity forces us to look beyond simple parts and wholes and consider structure itself. We've established that mereology generally denies that structure affects identity conditions. If composition is purely extensional, structure must be something else.
Right. Structure is the organization, ordering, repetition, or stratification of parts. Crucially, structure assigns distinctive roles to the parts,
Like the legs of a chair versus the back.
or the head of a pen versus the shaft. The atoms are the same, but their arrangement and function differ. Even if you accept extensionality, you can still acknowledge the importance of structure in organizing components, even if it doesn't change the object's numerical identity.
And as we saw earlier, even the nihilist who denies composite objects must talk about structure in some way. They need to explain why atoms arranged table-wise are different from atoms arranged chair-wise.
They do, but they redefine it. Since there is no table, only atoms arranged in the manner of a table, the nihilist talks about the arrangement of mereological atoms that are not proper parts of anything. The structure is characterized entirely by the ways in which these atoms stand in certain external relations to one another, touching, separated by distance, and so on.
So the structure is explained purely relationally.
Exactly.
Now, let's jump into the abstract world, where structure becomes absolutely vital and where mereological rules seem to break down, specifically concerning facts and propositions.
This is a key area. Propositions are abstract entities,
Yeah.
like the meaning of a sentence, that are the primary bearers of truth conditions. Facts are the entities that make those propositions true, or are truth makers.
And these entities necessitate structure in a way that often conflicts directly with the rules we just discussed for physical objects.
They do.
Why is structure so vital here? Why can't we treat a fact merely as the sum of its parts?
Think about the difference between two simple relational propositions. Athens is east of Rome, which is true, and Rome is east of Athens, which is false. The components involved, Athens, Rome, and the relation is east of, are exactly the same in both cases. But the resulting proposition and the corresponding fact or non-fact have different truth values.
So the difference must be accounted for by the order or the roles of the component.
It has to be. The same parts, but different results.
That sounds like a direct violation of the mereological extensionality of proper parts, which says that if the parts are the same, the whole must be the same.
It is a direct violation, and this is where we see the need for a non-mereological composition. If Reno loves Leno and Leno loves Reno are two separate numerically distinct facts, they possess the same proper parts, Reno, Leno, and the relation of loving.
But they are numerically distinct despite having the same parts.
And that conflicts directly with extensionality. So structured entities like facts require composition to be non-extensional.
So philosophers like David Armstrong use the term non-mereological composition to characterize this peculiar non-extensional relation between a fact and its parts.
Yes. The structure, the assignment of Reno as the subject, the lover, and Lino as the object, the beloved, and vice versa is what makes the difference. This shows that the basic structural rules governing concrete objects like chairs and mountains simply do not apply to abstract structured entities like facts and propositions. The metaphysician has to accommodate different logics for different layers of reality.
We started this deep dive asking, what the hell is water? And by applying the rational tools of metaphysics, from nominal versus real definitions to IBE and thought experiments, we have explored the very structural bedrock of reality.
It's been quite a journey.
We moved from the foundational debate on existence, looking at the radical difference between the everything exists Quinian view and the Menongian view of non-existent objects. We then tackled the core of identity, seeing how challenging it is to define sameness in the face of change, proving identity is irreducible against Leibnizian attempts, and examining substitution failures in language. And finally, we looked at how reality is constructed, finding that mereology governs our physical world, while structured, abstract entities require a completely different logic of parts. These are the underlying questions that shape everything we take for granted, forcing us to be, reflective swimmers.
And if we take our discussion on existence from Chapter 4 and connect it to how things persist over time, a concept explored heavily in later chapters of the source, we can end with a truly mind-bending, provocative conclusion.
Okay, let's hear it.
Consider the implications if we adopt a common contemporary view in the philosophy of time called eternalism.
Eternalism being the idea that all temporal entities, past, present, and future, exist in the same way, the so-called block universe view.
Exactly. There is no special status for the present moment. And if we combine eternalism with the persistence theory of perdurantism, the idea that objects persist by having temporal parts extended in time like a single four-dimensional worm through spacetime, then the entire notion of change shifts fundamentally.
So the apple turning from green and sour to red and sweet isn't really changing in the way we experience it.
No, it's simply that the temporal part of the apple at T1 is green and the temporal part of the apple at T2 is red.
So eternalists don't deny qualitative change. The apple at time T1 has the property green, and the apple at T2 has the property red.
Correct. They don't deny that.
Mm-hmm.
But they absolutely deny absolute becoming. The idea that entities truly begin or cease to exist. Nothing enters or leaves the block universe.
Oh, the passing of time.
The flow we subjectively feel is, as one thinker puts it, the biggest illusion of all. Our entire history, from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe, is frozen in a four-dimensional block of space-time.
If we accept this scientific image of a four-dimensional block universe, where our entire lifespan is already fixed as a single extended object,
then the identity of you is composed of all your temporal parts, stretching from birth to death. Qualitative change is just mere dissimilarity between your temporal parts. If this is true, and our entire history is already frozen, unchanging, and fixed in the block, how does that transform your understanding of identity and choice right now in this illusory present moment?
wow.
You may feel the freedom to choose your next action, but perhaps that choice and the consequences thereof is simply one fixed part of giant predetermined geometric structure that already fully exists. That's certainly something to mull over as you swim on.